Hi, and welcome to Introduction to Anti-Oppression Terminology. This video is brought to you by the Rainbow Diversity Institute, a company that does education on equity, diversity, and inclusion topics like this and many others. You can learn more about us at rainbowdiversityinstitute.ca. So today's video is going to provide you with a brief overview of the concept of microaggressions, which you've probably heard before as it's become a pretty popular word over the last decade or so. But we're going to talk a little bit about where the concept has come from and why it's useful for examining experiences of oppression and why it's useful to us in our efforts towards anti-oppression. So microaggressions are defined as the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slight snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to the target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So this is a definition that's taken directly from this book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation, written by Daryl Wing-Sue. Daryl Wing-Sue is pretty widely recognized as somebody who really expanded the concept of microaggressions to include these other aspects of identity, including race, gender, and sexual orientation, and to really be the one to extend this concept to the public eye in the way that people have adopted the concept of microaggressions in the last decade, though it actually has existed for a long time before that. So the concept actually originated in the 1970s and was coined by a man named Dr. Charles B. Pierce. And he was a Black psychiatrist who was treating a lot of Black patients and noticing that they were talking about experiences of racism that there wasn't really a word to capture, because at this time we really thought of racism as occurring in these more overt or explicit or violent ways. And so he was noticing that his clients were having a lot of these everyday experiences that really didn't cross the threshold of what we consider to be racism, but which were having a significant impact on their well-being. And so he coined this concept of racial microaggressions to name this experience, this everyday experience of these more subtle, slight snubs or insults that communicate a derogatory, hostile, or negative message to marginalized people. So a message of not belonging or a message of inferiority. What's important about microaggressions is that they can be verbal, nonverbal, or environmental. So they can be verbal in that they occur interpersonally between people and dialogue. They can be nonverbal in that they can show up in your body language and how you respond to people, but they can also be environmental. And so one example of an environmental microaggression that's very commonly experienced and seen is the positioning of light switches in rooms at a level to which they would be inaccessible for somebody who is using a chair or any kind of assisted mobility device. So that's one example of the way in which an environment can be constructed to send the message of not belonging or to send a hostile message to particular people. Similarly, you can think of the representation of racialized people in the higher realms of a particular institution or organization. And oftentimes we don't see that kind of representation. And that in itself is also an environmental microaggression, sending the message to racialized people or to BIPOC people in that industry, in that organization, and more generally that you don't really belong here, or there's only so far that you can advance. So let's examine one example of a microaggression, because examining microaggressions can be helpful for understanding what's really going on. So if we take the microaggression, this would be a verbal microaggression, I don't see color. Usually this is not intended to be harmful or microaggressive, but actually is intended to be some kind of positive statement about someone's lack of ability or lack of concern with race, for example. So usually when people say, I don't see color, what they're trying to say is it's irrelevant to me, I like all people equally, etc. But what actually gets communicated in this message is something different. So it's not true that someone could not see color, because we live in a society that's structured by race. And so it's actually impossible to not notice race. And if you are not noticing race, it's usually because race isn't as relevant to you, which means you probably don't experience racism, in which case not seeing color would be a function of a particular level of racial privilege. And we all participate in racism. in some way by virtue of living in a society that's structured by race, and that's structured by racism. And so this statement can't really be true. But what it communicates to the person on the receiving end or to those witnessing is that this person doesn't see the experiences of race and racism that someone might have. And this kind of comment can feel like an outright denial of the realities of racism. So it can be really alienating and harmful to people of color. And so though each person is different, of course, not all racialized people are going to feel personally harmed by this comment or offended by this comment. But microaggressions like these reinforce our kind of cultural failure to recognize and respond to race-based experiences. And so I hope this helps you to understand how a comment that can be so seemingly innocuous and subtle as "I don't see color" actually extends to these bigger meanings that are pretty significant to BIPOC people and racialized people. So I want to thank you so much for watching this video today and for doing some learning towards anti-oppression. You can find us and more videos and educational resources like these at rainbowdiversityinstitute.ca.